The lawyer's office smelled like old leather and broken dreams. I sat in the stiff-backed chair, my hands trembling slightly as Thomas Mitchell shuffled through the papers that would determine my future. The mahogany desk between us felt like a chasm, and his cold grey eyes avoided mine as he cleared his throat. "Miss Harper," he began, his voice carrying the weight of practiced indifference, "I'm afraid there's been a complication regarding your grandmother's will." My heart sank. Grandma Eleanor had been my anchor, the one person in the Harper family who understood my struggles with anxiety and depression. She'd held my hand through panic attacks, driven me to therapy appointments, and never once made me feel like I was broken. When she passed 3 months ago, I'd clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd left me something. Not for the money, but as a sign that someone in my family believed in me. "What kind of complication?" I managed to ask, though my voice came out smaller than I intended. Mitchell's fingers drummed against the desk. "Your family has raised concerns about your mental stability. They've petitioned the court to have you declared incompetent to inherit." The words hit me like a physical blow. I could feel the familiar tightness in my chest, the way my breathing became shallow when anxiety crept in. But I forced myself to stay present, to listen. "They claim," he continued, pulling out a thick folder, "that your history of psychiatric treatment, your multiple hospital stays, and your ongoing medication regimen make you unfit to manage any inheritance. They've provided documentation of your episodes." My cheeks burned with shame and rage. Those hospital stays had been voluntary. I'd checked myself in when I felt unsafe, when the depression became too heavy to carry alone. It was supposed to be taking care of myself, not evidence of my failure. "Who?" I whispered. "Who signed this petition?" Mitchell's expression didn't change. "Your Uncle Robert Harper, your Aunt Susan Collins Harper, and your cousin David Harper. They've requested that Mrs. Eleanor Harper's estate be divided among them, as they are the stable members of the family." The betrayal cut deeper than any panic attack ever had. These were people who'd sat at Grandma's dinner table, who'd smiled at me during family gatherings while apparently plotting behind my back. Uncle Robert, who'd always been cold but whom I'd thought was just private. Aunt Susan, who'd made passive-aggressive comments about my moods, but whom I'd tried to dismiss. And David, my own cousin who'd grown up with me, who knew exactly what I'd been through. "How much?" I asked, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "The estate is valued at approximately $2.3 million. It includes the farmland, the rental properties downtown, and various investments your grandmother accumulated over the years." $2.3 million. Enough to pay off my student loans, to buy a small house, to maybe start the art therapy practice I dreamed about. Enough to prove to myself that I could build something meaningful with my life. "What are my options?" I asked. Mitchell leaned back in his chair, studying me with what might have been pity. "You could contest the petition, but it would be expensive. Legal fees alone could run into the tens of thousands. And frankly, Miss Harper, given your documented history, it would be an uphill battle." "But it's possible." "Theoretically, yes. But I should warn you that your family has been quite thorough in their documentation. They have statements from your former therapist, copies of your medical records, even testimony from neighbors about incidents." I closed my eyes, trying to remember what incidents he might be referring to. There was the time I'd had a panic attack in the grocery store and paramedics had been called. The evening I'd been so depressed I'd sat on my front porch crying for hours, and Mrs. Henderson next door had called the police for a wellness check. Moments that had felt like the end of the world to me, now being used as weapons against my character. "I need time to think," I said, standing up on unsteady legs. "Of course. But Miss Harper, I should mention that the court date is set for next month. If you're going to contest this, you'll need to act quickly." I walked out of that office in a daze, the autumn air sharp against my face. My phone buzzed with a text from my cousin David. "Hope you're doing okay. Heard you met with Mitchell today. Family dinner this Sunday if you want to come." The casualness of it made my stomach turn. They were going to sit around Grandma's old dining room table, probably discussing how to divide up her belongings, and invite me like nothing had happened. Like they hadn't just tried to steal my inheritance by weaponizing my mental health struggles. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, watching people walk by on the sidewalk, living their normal lives while mine fell apart. Then I pulled out my phone and started Googling lawyers who specialized in contested wills. Most of the websites looked expensive, filled with men in expensive suits who probably charged more per hour than I made in a week at my part-time job at the community college. But then I found a small firm downtown, Chen and Associates. The photo showed a young Asian woman with kind eyes and a genuine smile. The website mentioned pro bono work and a focus on fighting discrimination. It was worth a shot. I called the number, expecting to get a receptionist or voicemail. Instead, a warm voice answered, "Chen and Associates, this is Sarah Chen speaking." "Hi," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think I need help. My family is trying to steal my inheritance because they think I'm crazy." There was a pause, then. "Can you come in tomorrow morning? Let's talk about this in person." For the first time in months, I felt a tiny spark of hope. Sarah Chen's office was nothing like Thomas Mitchell's imposing setup. The space was small and cluttered, with law books stacked on every surface and a coffee maker that looked like it had seen better days. But the walls were covered with photos of clients, real people, not corporate headshots, and there was a warmth here that I hadn't felt in a legal office before. Sarah herself was probably only a few years older than me, with shoulder-length black hair and wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a simple blazer over jeans, and when she shook my hand, her grip was firm and reassuring. "Madison, right? Please, sit down. Can I get you some coffee? It's terrible, but it's caffeinated." I accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "I'm not sure where to start," I admitted. "Start wherever feels right. I've got time." So I told her everything. About Grandma Eleanor, about my struggles with mental health, about the family who decided I was too broken to deserve my inheritance. Sarah listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting down notes but mostly just maintaining eye contact and nodding. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then leaned forward in her chair. "Madison, I want to be completely honest with you about what we're facing here. What your family is doing, using your mental health history against you, it's unfortunately not uncommon. There's still a lot of stigma and misunderstanding about mental illness, even in the legal system." My heart sank. "So you don't think I have a case?" "I didn't say that." Sarah's voice was firm. "In fact, I think what they're doing is not only morally wrong but potentially illegal. The Americans with Disabilities Act protects people from discrimination based on mental health conditions. And if your grandmother intended for you to inherit, that should matter. But I don't have a copy of her will. Mitchell said it was destroyed and that she died intestate." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That's interesting. Your grandmother was a businesswoman who owned significant property and investments. It would be highly unusual for someone like that to die without a will. Did she ever mention her estate planning to you?" I thought back to our conversations. She used to talk about wanting to make sure I was taken care of. She said she worried about me more than the others because I was sensitive, but she meant it in a good way. She said sensitive people were the ones who changed the world. Did she have her own attorney? Someone other than Mitchell? I think so. She mentioned someone named Garcia. Or maybe Gordon. I'm sorry, I should remember better. Don't apologize. We'll figure it out. Sarah made another note. Here's what I think we should do. First, we need to request copies of all the documents your family has submitted to the court. We have a right to see exactly what they're claiming. Second, we need to find your grandmother's original attorney. And third, we need to build a case that shows you're perfectly capable of managing an inheritance. But what about my medical records? My hospital stays? Sarah's expression softened. Madison, seeking help for mental health issues isn't a sign of weakness or incompetence. It's a sign of self-awareness and responsibility. You recognized when you needed support, And you got it. That shows good judgment, not poor judgment. I felt tears prick at my eyes. It had been so long since someone had framed my struggles in a positive light. There's something else, Sarah continued. I've been doing this for 5 years now, and I've seen cases like this before. Often, when family members suddenly claim someone is incompetent, it's because they're desperate to get their hands on money they think they deserve. Your Uncle Robert, he's been managing your grandmother's business affairs, right? Yes, for the past 10 years or so. Then he knows exactly how much money we're talking about. And he probably knows whether your grandmother had plans to leave you something. Sarah stood up and walked to her filing cabinet. I'm going to take your case, Madison. Pro bono, because I believe in fighting discrimination and because I think your family is trying to manipulate the system. I can't ask you to do that. I know lawyers are expensive, and I don't have much money. You're not asking. I'm offering. She pulled out a folder and handed it to me. This contains some forms we'll need to fill out, and information about what to expect. The court date is in 3 weeks, which doesn't give us much time, but it's workable. I stared at the folder, overwhelmed. Why are you helping me? Sarah sat back down, her expression serious. Because 10 years ago, my brother attempted suicide. He was brilliant, a software engineer, incredibly talented. But he had bipolar disorder, and during his worst episodes, he made some poor financial decisions. When he tried to get his life back together, our family treated him like he was broken. They excluded him from family businesses, didn't trust him with money, basically acted like his diagnosis meant he was incapable of making any decisions. What happened to him? He's doing great now. He got the right treatment, found a therapist who understood him, and he's been stable for 8 years. He runs his own consulting firm and just bought his first house. But it took years for our family to trust him again, and he still struggles with the shame they made him feel. Sarah's story gave me hope, but also highlighted the long road ahead. So what happens next? Next, we get to work. I need you to write down everything you can remember about your grandmother's wishes, any conversations you had about inheritance or money. I also need a list of all your healthcare providers, so we can get statements about your current mental health status. Statements. Character witnesses, essentially. People who can testify that you're stable, responsible, and capable of managing your affairs. Your current therapist, your psychiatrist, maybe employers or friends who can speak to your character. I thought about Dr. Williams, my therapist, who'd been working with me for 2 years. She'd seen me through my worst episodes and celebrated my progress. And there was Professor Martinez at the community college, who'd been encouraging me to apply for the art therapy graduate program. I think I can do that, I said. Sarah smiled. Good. And Madison? We're going to fight this. Not just for the money, but for your right to be treated with dignity and respect by your own family. As I left her office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Determination. My family might have given up on me, but I wasn't going to give up on myself. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of phone calls, document requests, and uncomfortable conversations. Sarah had been right about one thing. My family had been thorough in building their case against me. The stack of papers they'd submitted to the court was intimidating. Medical records going back 5 years, incident reports, even a statement from my former landlord about the time I'd been late on rent during a particularly bad depressive episode. Reading through it all felt like reliving my worst moments. They documented every panic attack, every therapy session, every time I'd struggled to get out of bed. But seeing it all laid out like that also made me angry. These weren't signs of incompetence. They were signs of someone fighting to get better. Look at this, Sarah said during one of our meetings, pointing to a section of the filing. They're claiming that your voluntary hospitalization 2 years ago shows dangerous impulsivity and inability to make rational decisions. But voluntary hospitalization is exactly the opposite. It's recognizing when you need help and taking steps to get it. I was sitting in her office again, surrounded by legal documents and empty coffee cups. It feels like they're twisting everything I've done to help myself into evidence that I'm broken. That's exactly what they're doing. But we're going to twist it right back. Sarah pulled out a folder. I've been busy too. First, I found your grandmother's original attorney. My heart jumped. Really? Patricia Gordon. She's retired now, but she agreed to meet with us. Apparently, she handled your grandmother's affairs for 30 years before Thomas Mitchell took over. When did Mitchell take over? About 18 months ago. Right around the time your grandmother's health started declining. Sarah's expression was grim. Gordon said she was surprised when Eleanor switched attorneys, especially to someone with so little experience in estate planning. The implication hung in the air between us. You think Uncle Robert influenced her decision? I think it's worth investigating. Gordon is coming in tomorrow to talk to us about what she remembers of your grandmother's intentions. The next day, Patricia Gordon turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s with silver hair and a no-nonsense attitude. She looked at me with curiosity rather than pity, which was refreshing. Eleanor talked about you often, she said without preamble. She was worried about you, but not in the way people worry about someone who's incompetent. She worried about you the way people worry about someone they love who's facing challenges. What did she say about her will? Sarah asked. She came to see me about 3 years ago, wanting to update her estate plan. She was very specific about wanting to provide for Madison's future. She said she knew Madison was struggling but that she believed in her potential. My throat tightened. She really said that? She did. She talked about how you were the most creative and empathetic person in the family, and how those qualities would serve you well once you found your footing. Gordon paused. She also expressed concerns about Robert's financial judgment and David's sense of entitlement. Sarah leaned forward. Did she draft a new will? We started the process, but then she called and said she needed to postpone. She said Robert was pressuring her to use his attorney instead, claiming it would be better for family harmony. Gordon shook her head. I should have pushed harder. I knew something wasn't right. Do you have any notes from those meetings? Sarah asked. I have everything. Draft documents, notes from our conversations, even some letters she wrote to me about her intentions. Gordon pulled out a file folder. I brought copies. I think you'll find them interesting. The documents were a revelation. In her own handwriting, Grandma Eleanor had outlined her wishes. The farmland would be sold and the proceeds split between her children and grandchildren, but the rental properties and investments would go to me, with the understanding that I would use them to build a stable future for myself. This is incredible, Sarah breathed. She was very clear about wanting to provide for Madison specifically. She was, Gordon agreed. She said Madison would need the security most, and that the others were already established in their careers. But the most damning document was a letter Grandma had written but never sent, expressing her frustration with Robert's attempts to control her decisions and her worry that he was trying to manipulate her into cutting me out of the will. Can we use this in court? I asked. Absolutely, Sarah said. This shows clear intent, and it raises serious questions about undue influence. Over the following days, we continued building our case. Dr. Williams, my therapist, wrote a detailed letter explaining my progress and current stability. Professor Martinez agreed to testify about my reliability and judgment. Even my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, no relation to Sarah, wrote a statement about how I'd helped her after her hip surgery, showing my capacity for responsibility and care. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. My former boss at the art supply store where I'd worked part-time for 3 years. Janet Reynolds had seen me through some of my worst periods, and she'd never once made me feel like my mental health struggles made me less capable. Madison is one of the most conscientious people I've ever worked with, she told Sarah during their phone interview. She's dealt with depression and anxiety, yes, but she's always been honest about her limitations and proactive about managing them. She's never let her personal struggles affect her work or her relationships with customers. Has she ever shown poor judgment in financial matters? Sarah asked. Never. She's actually very careful with money. She's been saving for college and never spends impulsively. If anything, she's more cautious than most people her age. As we prepared for the court date, I felt a mix of hope and terror. We had good evidence, but I knew my family would fight hard. They'd invested too much in painting me as incompetent to back down now. Are you ready for this? Sarah asked the night before the hearing. I have to be, I said. This isn't just about the money anymore. It's about proving that having mental health struggles doesn't make me less than human. Sarah nodded. Tomorrow we fight for your right to be seen as a whole person, not just a diagnosis. I went home that night and sat in my small apartment, looking at all the evidence we'd gathered. Letters from healthcare providers, testimony from friends and colleagues, legal documents showing my grandmother's true intentions. For the first time in months, I felt like I wasn't alone in this fight. My family had spent years making me feel like I was too broken to deserve love or respect. Tomorrow, I'd find out if the law agreed with them. The courthouse was smaller than I'd expected, but the weight of what was about to happen made it feel enormous. I sat next to Sarah at the defendant's table, trying to steady my breathing as my family filled the seats behind the plaintiff's table. Uncle Robert looked confident in his expensive suit, Aunt Susan whispered urgently to their attorney, and David avoided my eyes entirely. Judge William Reynolds was a man in his 60s with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He'd been on the bench for 20 years, Sarah had told me, and had a reputation for fairness and careful consideration of evidence. This is a hearing to determine the mental competency of Madison Harper to inherit from the estate of Eleanor Harper, Judge Reynolds announced. The petitioners claim that Miss Harper's mental health history renders her incapable of managing inherited assets. Miss Harper contests this claim. Thomas Mitchell stood up first, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never doubted his own importance. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. Madison Harper has a documented history of mental instability, including multiple psychiatric hospitalizations, ongoing medication dependency, and a pattern of erratic behavior that demonstrates her inability to make sound financial decisions. He spent the next hour methodically going through my medical history, making every therapy session sound like evidence of my incompetence and every hospital stay sound like proof of my danger to myself and others. When he described my voluntary admission 2 years ago, he made it sound like I'd been dragged away in restraints rather than having the wisdom to seek help when I needed it. The family is not unsympathetic to Miss Harper's struggles, Mitchell continued, but they have a responsibility to protect the assets that Eleanor Harper worked her entire life to accumulate. These assets require careful management and sound judgment, qualities that the evidence clearly shows Miss Harper lacks. Uncle Robert testified next, describing incidents that he'd witnessed over the years. He talked about the time I'd had a panic attack at a family dinner, making it sound like I'd been disruptive and inappropriate rather than struggling with genuine distress. He mentioned my periods of unemployment during bad depressive episodes, framing them as evidence of unreliability rather than the reality of managing a chronic condition. Madison is a sweet girl, he said with what sounded like genuine sadness, but she's never been able to handle responsibility. Even as a child, she was emotional and unpredictable. Eleanor loved her, but love doesn't change facts. Aunt Susan's testimony was more pointed. She described finding me crying in my car outside the grocery store one day, making it sound like evidence of public instability rather than a private moment of struggle that she'd happened to witness. She's been in and out of hospitals, Susan said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She takes multiple medications just to function day to day. How can someone like that be trusted with over $2 million? David's testimony was the hardest to hear because it felt the most personal. We'd grown up together, shared secrets and dreams, and now he was sitting on the witness stand describing me like I was a stranger. Madison and I used to be close, he said, but over the years, her mental health issues have gotten worse. She's unpredictable, sometimes she won't answer her phone for weeks, and she's made some concerning statements about not wanting to be alive. I care about her, but I honestly don't think she's capable of managing something as complex as an inheritance. When Mitchell finished presenting their case, I felt hollowed out. They'd taken every vulnerable moment of my life and weaponized it against me. But then Sarah stood up, and I remembered why I was fighting. "Your Honor," she began, "the petitioners would have you believe that seeking mental health treatment is evidence of incompetence. They would have you believe that having depression or anxiety disqualifies someone from basic human rights. But the evidence shows exactly the opposite." Sarah methodically went through the same incidents my family had described, but she reframed them completely. My voluntary hospitalization became evidence of self-awareness and responsibility. My therapy sessions became proof of my commitment to managing my health. My periods of unemployment became temporary setbacks that I'd worked hard to overcome. Madison Harper didn't let her mental health struggles define her, Sarah said. She faced them head-on, sought treatment, and built a stable life for herself. That takes courage and judgment, not incompetence. Dr. Williams testified about my progress over the past 2 years, describing how I'd learned to manage my symptoms and build healthy coping mechanisms. "Madison is one of my most insightful patients," she said. "She's developed excellent self-awareness and has never shown poor judgment in managing her life or finances." Professor Martinez talked about my reliability and creativity, describing how I'd helped other students and taken on additional responsibilities without being asked. "Madison has excellent judgment and strong problem-solving skills," he said. "Her sensitivity and empathy, which her family seems to view as weaknesses, are actually tremendous strengths." But the most powerful testimony came from Patricia Gordon, who took the stand with the confidence of someone who'd spent 30 years practicing law. "Eleanor Harper was very specific about her intentions," Gordon said, holding up the documents we'd found. "She wanted to provide for Madison's future because she believed in Madison's potential. She was concerned about Robert's financial judgment and David's sense of entitlement, but she never expressed any doubts about Madison's competence." Sarah introduced the letter Grandma had written expressing her frustration with Robert's attempts to control her decisions. When Gordon read it aloud, I saw Uncle Robert's face turn red. "Robert keeps pushing me to use his attorney," Gordon read, "and he's made several comments about Madison not deserving to inherit because of her mental health struggles. But Madison is the most caring and responsible person in our family. Her challenges have made her stronger, not weaker." The courtroom was completely silent when Gordon finished reading. Judge Reynolds looked thoughtful as he made notes. Finally, Sarah called me to the stand. My hands were shaking as I was sworn in, but I looked directly at the judge and tried to project confidence I didn't entirely feel. "Madison," Sarah began gently, "can you tell the court about your relationship with your grandmother?" I talked about how Grandma Eleanor had been my champion, how she'd driven me to therapy appointments and never made me feel ashamed of my struggles. I described our conversations about my future, how she'd encouraged me to pursue art therapy and talked about wanting to help me build a stable life. "She used to say that sensitive people were the ones who changed the world," I said, looking directly at my family. "She said my empathy and creativity were gifts, not weaknesses." Sarah asked me about my current mental health status, my plans for the future, and my understanding of financial responsibility. I answered honestly about my struggles but also about my progress and my dreams. "Your Honor," I said in closing, "I'm not asking for this inheritance because I think I deserve it. I'm asking for it because my grandmother wanted me to have it, and because I want to honor her memory by using it to build something meaningful with my life." When I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt like I'd said everything I needed to say. Now it was up to Judge Reynolds to decide whether my mental health struggles made me unworthy of my grandmother's love and legacy. The courtroom was dead silent as Judge Reynolds reviewed his notes. I could hear my own heartbeat and the rustle of papers as he organized his thoughts. Sarah reached over and squeezed my hand, and I tried to draw strength from her confidence. "This has been a complex case," Judge Reynolds began, "involving questions that go to the heart of how we view mental health and human dignity in our society." He looked up from his notes, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom before settling on me. "The petitioners have presented extensive documentation of Miss Harper's mental health history. They've shown that she has struggled with depression and anxiety, that she has sought treatment including hospitalization, and that she takes medication to manage her symptoms. They argue that these factors render her incompetent to inherit. My stomach dropped. He was listing everything my family had said about me. However, Judge Reynolds continued, the law requires more than just evidence of mental health treatment to establish incompetence. The law requires evidence that a person cannot understand the nature and consequences of their actions, cannot make reasoned decisions, or poses a danger to themselves or others. He picked up one of the documents from his desk. The evidence presented by Miss Harper's counsel tells a very different story. Dr. Williams, a licensed psychologist, testified that Miss Harper has made significant progress in managing her mental health and shows excellent judgment in her personal and financial decisions. Professor Martinez testified to her reliability and strong problem-solving skills. Her former employer described her as conscientious and financially responsible. Judge Reynolds set the document down and looked directly at my family. More troubling is the evidence regarding the circumstances of this petition. Patricia Gordon, Mrs. Eleanor Harper's attorney for 30 years, testified that Mrs. Harper had clearly expressed her intention to provide for Miss Harper's future. She presented documentation showing that Mrs. Harper viewed Miss Harper's mental health struggles not as incompetence, but as evidence of her sensitivity and strength. Uncle Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Aunt Susan's face had gone pale. The court has also reviewed the letter written by Mrs. Harper expressing her frustration with family members' attempts to influence her estate planning decisions. This letter raises serious questions about undue influence and whether the petitioner's claims are motivated by genuine concern for Miss Harper's welfare or by their own financial interests. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, his voice growing stronger. Let me be clear about something. Seeking mental health treatment is not evidence of incompetence. It is evidence of wisdom, self-awareness, and responsibility. A person who recognizes when they need help and takes steps to get it is demonstrating exactly the kind of sound judgment we should encourage, not penalize. I felt tears starting to form in my eyes, but they were tears of relief rather than despair. The Americans with Disabilities Act protects people from discrimination based on mental health conditions. What the petitioners are asking this court to do, to strip Miss Harper of her inheritance rights based solely on her mental health history, would be a clear violation of that protection. Judge Reynolds stood up, and the entire courtroom rose with him. The evidence shows that Madison Harper is a thoughtful, responsible young woman who has faced significant challenges and met them with courage and determination. Her mental health struggles do not diminish her worth as a person or her capacity to make decisions about her own life. He paused, looking directly at me. The petition to declare Madison Harper incompetent is denied. Furthermore, based on the evidence presented regarding Mrs. Eleanor Harper's intentions, this court finds that Miss Harper is entitled to inherit according to her grandmother's wishes as documented by Attorney Gordon. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own breathing, the tick of the clock on the wall, the shuffle of feet as people processed what had just happened. Additionally, Judge Reynolds continued, this court is troubled by the evidence of potential undue influence in Mrs. Harper's decision to change attorneys shortly before her death. I am referring this matter to the State Bar for investigation into the conduct of Attorney Mitchell and his handling of Mrs. Harper's estate. Thomas Mitchell's face went white. Uncle Robert half stood from his seat, then sat back down heavily. Court is adjourned. As the judge left the courtroom, chaos erupted. Uncle Robert was arguing loudly with Mitchell, Aunt Susan was crying, and David was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. But I barely noticed any of it because Sarah was hugging me and I was crying and laughing at the same time. We did it, Sarah whispered. We actually did it. I looked across the courtroom at my family, the people who had tried to steal my inheritance by convincing a judge that I was too broken to deserve it. Uncle Robert was glaring at me with unconcealed anger, but there was something else in his expression too, defeat. Madison. I turned to see David approaching hesitantly. Can we talk? I don't think we have anything to say to each other, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. I thought you should know that I didn't want to do this. Dad pressured me into it. He said it was for your own good, that you'd be better off without the responsibility. Do you believe that? I asked. David looked down at his feet. I don't know what I believe anymore. Well, I do, I said. I believe that Grandma Eleanor knew exactly what she was doing when she wanted to leave me that inheritance. She saw something in me that you and the rest of the family couldn't see, or chose not to see. I walked away from him then, away from all of them, and followed Sarah out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun. So what happens now? I asked. Now you inherit your grandmother's legacy, Sarah said with a smile. The rental properties, the investments, everything she wanted you to have. It'll take a few weeks to process everything, but you're going to be financially secure. And what about Uncle Robert and the others? They'll get their share of the farmland sale, just like your grandmother originally planned. But they won't get the windfall they were hoping for by cutting you out. I thought about what I wanted to do with the inheritance. Art therapy school, definitely. Maybe I'd buy a small house with a studio where I could work. I'd donate some money to mental health organizations, and maybe I'd set up a scholarship for other students who are struggling with mental health issues. Sarah, I said, I want you to know that this wasn't just about the money for me. I know, she said. It was about dignity. It was about your right to be seen as a whole person, not just a diagnosis. Thank you, I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. Thank you for believing in me when my own family wouldn't. As we walked to her car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine confidence in my own worth. My family had tried to convince a judge that I was too broken to deserve love, respect, or financial security. But Judge Reynolds had seen through their manipulation and recognized what Grandma Eleanor had always known, that my struggles hadn't made me weak. They'd made me strong. I pulled out my phone and deleted the text thread with David. I blocked Uncle Robert's number and Aunt Susan's too. I didn't need people in my life who saw my mental health struggles as evidence of my unworthiness. Instead, I texted Dr. Williams. Court case went well. Ready to talk about graduate school applications at our next session. Then I called Professor Martinez to tell him the good news and ask for a letter of recommendation. My family had spent months trying to prove that I was too unstable to inherit anything. What they'd actually proven was that I was strong enough to fight for myself, smart enough to find good allies, and brave enough to stand up to people who had power over me. As Sarah drove me home, I looked out the window at the town where I'd grown up, where I'd struggled and survived and was now thriving. Grandma Eleanor had believed in my potential, and now I was ready to prove her right. The inheritance would give me financial security, but the real gift was the knowledge that I was worthy of love, respect, and all the opportunities that life had to offer. My mental health struggles were part of my story, but they weren't the whole story. I was Madison Harper, and I was enough.